In 2017, Arma, or should I say Bohemia Interactive, tried something a little bit different. A free, total conversion for Arma 3. Argo was a hardcore tactical first-person shooter. It pretty much used the same engine, the same mechanics, and let's be honest, the same assets and bones as Arma 3. But it was free to play, it was a small-scale shooter, and, well, it didn't quite go to plan. The game very quickly fell off the face of the earth and proved that Arma just wasn't suited to certain types of gameplay. But what was it? Why did Bohemia leave it? And why did the player base no longer remember that it even existed? This is the free-to-play Arma game you never even knew existed. As a bit of a heads up, when I actually played it on its initial release, it was called Project Argo. It was then renamed to just Argo, so I'm going to use them interchangeably. Please don't hate me for it. I know what you like. There were two factions within the game, Clouds versus Flames. Yes, they are the actual names. What is it with just red versus blue works fine. You can start out as certain ranks, and like a rookie operator, you gain experience, you can unlock new weapons and attachment and gear, sort of RPG-like, but within this fast-paced first-person shooter. The game was actually set within a map that we'd seen in the past. Operation Flashpoint was one of the first titles within Bohemia Interactive's franchise, and within that, Malden, the main map, came back as Malden 2035. It was 62 kilometers squared, and it was a complete modern reimagining of Bohemia Interactive's initial title. And whilst it was such a huge map, it was split down into smaller combat zones, hence the faster paced attempts at gameplay. The competitive game modes were actually 5v5. You were part of this smaller based unit, with other real players obviously, although I think there was the option for bots within it. Clash had 2 units fighting over the territory of a series of combat engagements. Link, the objective was to capture a chain of points before the enemy takes control, and Raid tasks 1 unit to find a data terminal while the other unit needs to defend 3 possible locations. It was your very bang average Arma stuff. Within it, it also had a co-op mode, teaming up with up to 10 hired guns and fighting against AI. Honestly, one of my favorite things to do, even in Arma to this day. Is that because I'm terrible at the game? I would argue no. It probably is. Even on something like Insurgency Sandstorm, I still just play against AI. But the game also had some promise. I mean, it was free to play and there was a decent amount of content. Okay, most of that content was pretty much ripped straight over from Arma 3. It had authentic guns. That was because of Arma 3. If it had really well-formed terrain, it was because of Arma 3. It had a 3D scenario editor. Yeah, that was... well, you know what I mean. The game had a pretty big launch, though. In 2017, it gained 6,600 concurrent players, which, I mean, this was probably at Arma 3's peak. Not that the game has ever died, but that title has just been a behemoth. So making a free-to-play variant of it was going to be a hit anyway. But almost instantaneously, within the next 6 months, the game dwindled. By the time 2018 came around, it was down to 200, 150, 100, which for a multiplayer-only title was, well, soon to be a failure. Then, in 2021, support was completely cut off and servers were shut down. There was still the possibility to play some sort of co-op mode within it, but if I'm going to be honest, there was really no future for this title. So why did this happen? What was the linchpin that swept the legs out from under this free-to-play title? Because on the surface it sounds pretty good. A free-to-play Arma game, an incredibly successful franchise of military simulation unlike anything else. Yet the problem, at least from my perspective, is the things that made Arma great were the things that destroyed Project Argo. Okay, let's take a look at the Arma series. Why is it so successful? For starters, it is the peak of simulation. Anybody that wants authentic experience with weaponry, vehicles, okay, if you like helicopters controlling like merry-go-rounds, or commanding movements on maps, Arma is the way to go. When Arma 3 released in 2013, it really reached the peak for simulator shooters, and that's why there hasn't been an Arma game since. I mean, some of these missions, doing submarine assaults of islands, whether it was PvP in big clan battles where people would come together to roleplay certain scenarios, or, like I mentioned, against AI, where you're taking out different towns with fellow soldiers, communicating and commanding in chats, taking squads, having forward outward bases, and of course being picked up by helicopter pilots. You know what Arma is, and it is fantastic for it. But one of its main selling points is these huge maps. The reason that you need to be able to communicate with other players is because you need people that are vehicle drivers, that need to drop you off at landing zones. It creates this symphony of roleplay that no other game has really been able to capture on the same scale. and then bringing it to a small 5v5 first-person shooter, where's the audience for that? Because, don't get me wrong, there are people that love fast-paced 5v5 games, but they're not the Arma franchise fans. This is a community of hardcore simulators. Even people that casually play the Arma games, speaking from experience, enjoy the fact that you can really immerse yourself, even if it's just for a couple hours a night. There's other things that I do for a couple hours a night that, honestly, seem more worth my time these days, though. So the community just wasn't there for Project Argo. The huge spike we saw at its initial release and then the massive drop-off so soon afterwards indicates more towards a curiosity to what Bohemia Interactive had been working on. Because remember, this was 4-5 years after Arma 3 and people were expecting a new title. When they heard Argo, Bohemia's next project, of course, there was some intrigue. The other issue was to do with Arma itself. Because whilst I could spout all the praise about the Arma franchise, Arma 2 particularly being my favorite, it has got one thing that I think it's famed for, and that's terrible gunplay. Okay, before you go screaming at me, I just want to make something very, very clear. For what it is within the game itself, it works absolutely fine, probably because it is more realistic. But that means fiddling with safety locks, running out of ammo too quickly, not having the right weapon for the right scenario. All this sort of stuff is what makes Arma great and why the community fantasizes over these military scenarios. And don't argue with me, that is exactly what you are doing when you play those games. However, putting that in a fast-paced shooter does not work at all. You need something like a Call of Duty, where everything is too slick and too fast. There is no realism to the guns. You can reload in 2.3 seconds. Your rate of fire is faster than Sonic the Hedgehog on speed. And really, that just wasn't what Bohemia Interactive was good at. The engine just didn't know how to do that. And I think that was one of the main reasons that the title just didn't quite work. In some sort of comparison, a game like Battlefield 4 has a 16 millisecond lag when it comes to moving your mouse and seeing the response from your character on screen. Project Argo on launch was about 166. Yeah, your Domino's orders coming before you can turn around a corner in that game. For a competitive shooter, it just wasn't it. And actually, it really showed that Bohemia Interactive were not ready for this style, because after everything, after the game died and people moved on, I think it's good to look at the positives that came from Project Argo, because there were so many, more than I think you'd realize. First of all, there was pretty much no risk for Bohemia Interactive. It was a free-to-play game that they weren't really expected to make any money from it. Sure, it was their attempt to kind of poke their toes into the competitive market, yet they kind of half-arsed it, so it was never really going to go anywhere. But it was using very, very similar stuff to Arma 3. A lot was ported over. It was dumbed down to the point where a lot of Arma players were complaining about, well, the way the guns work, which for a first-person shooter is somewhat important. Arma just does about everything it needs to for a huge, large, open-scale warfare game. It's not perfect. When you shoot baddies, they fall over about 342 years after the bullet penetrates their skull. Yet, it really gives you that sense of scale. It brings a huge amount of immersion to everybody that plays it. And if I'm going to be honest, Argo, I think, probably sold more copies for Arma than anything else. A lot of people used it as a stepping stone, a free way to get into the franchise to see if it was something they would like, and sure, it might have put a few people off. I'm going to be honest, I think it just showed a teaser, a little taster of what the true potential of this series could be. It was an experiment for Bohemia Interactive. Feedback alone from the low-risk product would hugely benefit them going forward. And whilst a lot of people sit there wondering, I didn't even know this game existed, I think it was an important stepping stone. We saw later on Arma Reforger come out for the series that, whilst being controversial, is another one of these experiments. Without being a full Arma game, it tests a few new features, a new engine, and a hint of what's coming for the franchise later on. Being way more successful than Project Argo ever was, while still having its negative feedback, I think it proves that Bohemia Interactive are not scared to experiment, to push the boat out a little bit and do stuff that they don't know if it will or won't be a success, but it happens anyway. And let's hope this goes on to improve the franchise that we all know and love to this day. Daisy Standalone, that's the one. Daisy Standalone. God damn it, I need to make a video on that game.